Have you ever wondered why entire nations collapse financially even when they seem stable on the surface, almost as if they are following a hidden script written long before their leaders come to power? The truth is unsettling. Every economic fall in modern history follows a predictable six-stage financial cycle. And today, countries like Haiti, China, and Nicaragua are not exceptions. They are symptoms of a deeper pattern. When you look at the data, the political decisions, the international loans, and the silent economic pressures, it becomes impossible to ignore that Latin America as a whole is already standing at stage 5, the point where nations stop choosing their future and begin reacting to crises they can no longer control. But before we look at the collapse itself, we need to understand something far more uncomfortable. Most people think financial crises explode out of nowhere, triggered by sudden events. Yet the real danger starts decades earlier, quietly beneath the surface, long before the headlines show panic. And this is where the cycle begins its slow movement. Small debts justified as temporary solutions, currency exposure framed as modernization, foreign influence disguised as partnership. At first, everything seems stable, even prosperous. Growth rises, opportunities appear, capital flows. But slowly, silently, a dependency is born. This dependency strengthens global actors while weakening national sovereignty, pushing countries step by step toward a point where their internal decisions no longer belong to them. As we unravel this pattern, you will start to notice something disturbing. These processes repeat across empires, economies, and centuries, no matter the ideology, no matter the leaders, no matter the promises. The cycle follows the same phases every time, like a historical algorithm. And what you're about to see suggests that nations across Latin America are not just participating in this cycle. They are dangerously close to the irreversible edge. You ever felt like your country is living through something you can't quite explain? Stay with this idea because what you will discover now might surprise you, maybe even unsettle you, but it will finally make sense. Before we move forward, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever felt that your country is repeating patterns you have seen in other collapsing economies? Your perspective matters because understanding this content changes how we interpret our own reality. And if this topic resonates with you, make sure to leave a like and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. It helps us reach more people who need to see this. And as we continue, let's trace the first steps of this financial cycle, steps that most governments ignore until it is already too late. At the beginning of every financial collapse, there is always a moment that looks harmless, almost logical, a moment when nations accept terms they believe they can control. This is the foundation of stage 1, the phase where powerful nations and global institutions quietly create the perfect conditions for future instability. It never starts with direct confrontation. It begins with agreements, loans, infrastructure promises, and developmental partnerships that appear beneficial on the surface. Countries celebrate these deals as signs of modernization, as proof that they are finally integrating into global markets. But underneath the celebratory speeches and optimistic forecasts, a more strategic game is unfolding, one designed to shift leverage from the borrowing nation to the lending power. When a country opens its doors to foreign capital, it also opens the mechanisms that will later shape its economic destiny. Interest rates, trade quotas, currency exposure, and long-term debt structures are negotiated by people who often do not fully understand the long-term consequences. At first, borrowing feels like progress. Roads are built, ports expand, political leaders take credit for rapid modernization, and the population feels the immediate benefits. But while all eyes are fixed on these new accomplishments, the dependency cycle begins tightening its grip. Each borrowed dollar creates a new obligation, each project requires maintenance, and each promise made to external investors slowly becomes a constraint that limits the nation's freedom to maneuver. What makes this stage so dangerous is how invisible it is to most citizens. They see growth and assume strength. They see foreign involvement and assume partnership. But global powers are not helping out of generosity. They are positioning themselves. The economic structures they introduce, from privatization models to currency pegs, are formulated to ensure that the borrower cannot operate independently. The country becomes tied to external performance metrics, international credit ratings, and regulatory frameworks that no longer align with its internal needs. The sovereign space shrinks without anyone noticing, replaced by guidelines set thousands of miles away by institutions that hold the real leverage. With each new agreement, the asymmetry grows. The borrowing nation relies on capital inflows to sustain growth. And once that reliance is established, the lender can dictate terms. This is why stage 1 is the most deceptive phase. It looks like progress, but functions like preparation. And as soon as the country becomes accustomed to this dependency, when its budgets, development, plans, and political decisions hinge on external approval, the door opens to the next stage of the financial cycle, a stage where the illusion of control starts to dissolve and the true cost of early decisions becomes impossible to ignore. Once a nation crosses the threshold from initial borrowing into sustained reliance, the financial cycle shifts into a far more complex and dangerous phase. This is where debt is no longer a tool for development, but becomes the central mechanism shaping political decisions, social stability, and national direction. The public rarely understands how quickly this transformation happens, because on the surface, the country still appears functional. Trade continues, the currency circulates, and institutions operate. But beneath that familiar structure, the pressure begins to build in ways that are subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore. The most powerful force in this stage is not the debt itself, but its design. External creditors' structure. Repayment schedules, interest rate adjustments, currency exposure, and refinancing options in a way that ensures predictable long-term dependency. A nation might believe it is simply managing obligations, but in reality, its economic strategy becomes dictated by the very institutions holding its debt. This is when governments begin prioritizing external expectations over internal needs, often cutting social spending, freezing wages, and sacrificing strategic sectors just to satisfy lenders. These decisions are masked as fiscal responsibility, but in truth, they are symptoms of shrinking sovereignty. As dependency deepens, the national currency becomes increasingly vulnerable. Foreign investors watch every fluctuation, every political shift, every policy announcement. Even a rumor can trigger capital flight, forcing governments to intervene desperately to stabilize their currency. Yet every intervention leads to more borrowing, more concessions, more structural adjustments. What once looked like a temporary financial burden becomes an inescapable cycle. The country is no longer managing its economy, it is managing the expectations of foreign powers that now influence everything from interest rates to trade agreements. This phase also transforms internal politics. Governments start making decisions not based on long-term national vision, but on short-term survival. They negotiate quietly behind closed doors, hoping to delay the impact of debt obligations, often making promises they cannot keep. Opposition groups rise, fueled by frustration as public services deteriorate and living costs rise. The population senses that something is wrong, but they cannot see the root cause. They blame corruption, mismanagement, or ideology, unaware that the deeper issue lies in the financial architecture shaping every decision. And slowly, social tension merges with economic fragility. What began as manageable debt evolves into a national vulnerability that touches every aspect of daily life. Prices increase, savings lose value, and industries struggle to remain competitive. The illusion of stability begins to fade as the country edges toward the next phase, where economic pressure no longer remains hidden beneath the surface but erupts into visible instability that can no longer be dismissed or contained. As the financial cycle progresses, nations move into a phase where external pressure and internal weakness begin to collide with increasing force. This is the moment when the economy no longer bends quietly under hidden obligations. It starts cracking in ways that ordinary citizens can finally feel. Prices rise unpredictably, government budgets shrink, and entire sectors operate under a constant sense of strain. Leaders insist that everything is under control, yet every decision reveals how little room they actually have. Inflation responds not to local policy, but to international expectations. Currency movements react not to national productivity, but to the sentiment of investors abroad. The country becomes reactive instead of strategic, waiting for the next shock, the next downgrade, the next demand for adjustment. In this stage, governments double down on measures that appear rational but deepen the long-term crisis. They cut subsidies, reduce social programs, and increase taxes to signal responsibility to foreign creditors. But these measures rarely generate true stability. Instead, they slow economic activity, weaken domestic industries, and fuel resentment among citizens who feel the effects directly. The wealthy move assets abroad, fearful of what comes next, while the middle class watches its purchasing power erode month by month. Meanwhile, the poorest communities are hit hardest, facing rising costs, without the support systems needed to survive prolonged instability. At the same time, foreign lenders and international institutions begin tightening requirements. They push for policy reforms, structural changes, and regulatory adjustments that go far beyond simple financial management. These demands are presented as necessary corrections, but their true purpose is to ensure repayment above all else. As the country complies, it gradually reshapes its entire economy to satisfy external expectations. Industries that once defined national identity may shrink or vanish because they are no longer aligned with the new guidelines. Strategic assets may be privatized or transferred to foreign control under the pressure of refinancing deals. This is how sovereignty fades, not through overt conquest, but through economic restructuring imposed from the outside. Social tension rises as these realities settle in. People begin to question the effectiveness of their leaders, the fairness of the system, and the motives behind every policy. Protests grow more frequent, distrust spreads, and as internal confidence collapses, the financial markets react instantly, deepening the crisis further. What was once an abstract conversation about debt becomes a daily struggle for stability. The country stands at a fragile intersection where economic fragility meets social pressure, preparing the ground for the next and most dangerous stage of the cycle, when the nation stops reacting calmly and begins facing consequences that reshape its trajectory entirely. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you see these patterns happening around you, or have you witnessed similar stages unfolding in other countries? Your insight helps expand this conversation and adds depth to the analysis as we move deeper into the cycle. By the time a nation reaches stage 5, the financial cycle stops being a distant threat and becomes a daily, visible reality that shapes every aspect of life. This is the point where the country no longer controls its own momentum. The decisions made decades earlier, the loans accepted under political optimism, the agreements signed without understanding their long-term weight. Everything converges into a situation that feels both sudden and inevitable. Stage 5 is not merely economic instability. It is the moment when a nation begins to lose the ability to determine its own future. Latin America today sits precisely at this threshold where external leverage, internal fractures, and structural weaknesses all collide. In this stage, governments are trapped between conflicting pressures. On one side, foreign creditors demand stricter measures, more reforms, and unfaltering repayment schedules regardless of social cost. On the other side, citizens face rising prices, declining public services, and diminishing economic opportunities. The government attempts to appease both sides, but every compromise worsens the crisis. Efforts to stabilize the currency drain reserves. Attempts to boost growth increase debt. Measures to satisfy external institutions trigger domestic unrest. Nothing works because stage 5 is the moment when contradictions can no longer be balanced. They must be confronted. What makes stage 5 especially dangerous for Latin America is that the region has entered this phase not as isolated countries, but as a collective pattern. Nations across the continent face similar structural dependencies, similar vulnerabilities, and similar external pressures. Growth depends heavily on commodity exports, leaving economies exposed to global price fluctuations. Political polarization undermines long-term planning. Institutions lack the resilience needed to endure prolonged financial stress. This combination creates a cycle where every shock, whether political or economic, spreads faster and hits harder than before. Meanwhile, foreign powers, both old and newly emerging, exploit this fragility with strategic precision. They expand influence through loans, infrastructure deals, and partnerships framed as mutual development. But behind each agreement lies an increasingly clear pattern. Assets shift outward, leverage shifts upward, and autonomy shifts downward. Countries become dependent not only on money, but on the expectations, policies, and geopolitical interests of those providing it. This is why Latin America's stage 5 is so alarming. It is not just financial exposure, it is geopolitical vulnerability at a continental scale. And as economic pressure intensifies, the social fabric begins to unravel. People lose trust in institutions. Businesses hesitate to invest. Inflation becomes a permanent presence. Migration rises as citizens look for opportunities elsewhere. The nation enters a psychological recession long before the official numbers confirm it. This atmosphere of uncertainty and tension marks the true essence of stage 5, a stage where the crisis stops being theoretical and becomes a lived experience, a stage that prepares the ground for the transition into the final phases, where the consequences are no longer gradual but transformative. Haiti stands as one of the clearest and most tragic examples of a nation trapped inside the financial cycle with virtually no escape route. When people look at Haiti today, they see instability, poverty, and institutional collapse. But what they often fail to understand is how much of this crisis was engineered over generations through external pressures, unsustainable debt structures, and geopolitical manipulation. Haiti's position in stage 5 did not appear suddenly. It was built step by step through decisions made under coercion, agreements accepted under desperation, and economic models imposed from outside forces that prioritized control over development. The country's struggle began long before modern institutions existed, when Haiti was forced to pay an extraordinary indemnity to France after winning its own independence. This debt was so massive that it drained national resources for over a century, diverting funds that could have built infrastructure, strengthened institutions, or stabilized the economy. Instead, nearly all available capital flowed outward. This created a foundational weakness that future governments inherited: a structural trap that made growth nearly impossible. By the time global financial systems evolved in the 20th century, Haiti was already deeply disadvantaged, with no real bargaining power and no leverage to influence the terms imposed upon it. As Haiti entered the modern financial era, the pattern intensified. International lenders occasionally injected capital, but these loans came with strict conditions that reshaped the country's economy in ways that weakened its internal resilience. Industries that once supported local communities were replaced by imported goods subsidized by foreign powers. Agriculture, once a backbone of national identity, deteriorated due to policy shifts pushed by external agencies. The result was a growing dependency on imports and a shrinking productive capacity, pushing Haiti further into vulnerability with each passing decade. Political instability only accelerated the process. Governments came and went, often under pressure or intervention, leaving little room for coherent long-term planning. Corruption and mismanagement existed, but they flourished in an environment designed for dependency. For a nation already weakened by structural debt, every crisis, natural or political, became a multiplier of instability. Earthquakes, hurricanes, and social unrest didn't just cause temporary damage. They pushed the country deeper into the cycle, forcing it to seek external aid that often reinforced the same vulnerabilities. Today, Haiti exemplifies what happens when a nation reaches a point where economic, political, and social pressures combine in a way that leaves no room for recovery without a complete restructuring of the system. Prices rise unpredictably, institutions struggle to function, foreign influence defines national trajectories more than internal voices. The country lives in a state where every shock becomes existential, and every decision is shaped by constraints imposed decades earlier. Haiti is not just at stage 5, it has been living there for years, showing the world what happens when the financial cycle runs unchecked, and a nation loses the ability to push against it. China's growing influence across the developing world is often framed as a new era of partnership, a shift away from Western financial dominance toward a supposedly more balanced global order. But when you study the historical patterns and examine the structure of China's international lending, a different picture emerges, one that mirrors the same mechanisms used by previous global powers to expand their leverage through debt. Nations believe they are securing progress, development, and long-term stability, yet the terms embedded in these agreements often place them on a path that looks remarkably similar to the later stages of the financial cycle. China hasn't reinvented the game, it has mastered the old one. The strategy is subtle but powerful. Chinese loans are typically large, fast-moving, and tied directly to infrastructure projects that appear transformative. Ports, railways, highways, power plants. These projects create immediate visible progress, giving governments something to showcase to their citizens. But underneath the surface, the repayment structures are strict, the collateral clauses are firm, and the contracts often stipulate Chinese control over key assets if the borrower fails to meet obligations. This is not accidental. It is a calculated model designed to secure influence through strategic leverage rather than open confrontation. For countries already struggling with fragile economies, China becomes an attractive alternative to Western institutions that demand reforms and political conditions. Chinese financing promises fewer questions and faster results, but the long-term cost is rarely understood up front. Once repayment difficulties begin, China gains negotiating power. Extensions, restructurings, and refinancing come with new requirements: preferential access to natural resources, long-term leases on ports or industrial zones, or increased political alignment. What began as development assistance gradually morphs into strategic dependency. In Latin America, this dynamic is unfolding at an accelerated pace. Nations facing fiscal weakness see Chinese investment as a lifeline, but the more they depend on it, the more vulnerable they become to external influence. China's position as both creditor and partner grants it extraordinary leverage over national policy, regulatory decisions, and even diplomatic alignment. This is how Stage 5 evolves into something deeper, a moment when financial vulnerability merges with geopolitical exposure. And for countries like Nicaragua, the shift is already visible. The pattern is no longer hypothetical. It is active, shaping decisions that affect sovereignty itself. As these developments spread across the continent, the landscape of influence shifts. China is not replacing the old powers with a gentler system. It is inserting itself into the same historical cycle that is repeated for centuries. The mechanisms are familiar, the outcomes predictable, and the consequences increasingly unavoidable. And as Latin America moves further into Stage 5, China's role becomes central to understanding what comes next, how the region will navigate its vulnerabilities, and whether nations can still reclaim autonomy before reaching the point of no return. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments what you think about this dynamic. Do you see China as a stabilizing force or as a new participant in an old pattern of financial control? Your perspective helps deepen the analysis and adds important nuance to this conversation. Nicaragua represents one of the clearest examples of a country quietly sliding from stage 5 into the early shadows of stage 6, where financial vulnerability begins, merging with political rigidity and strategic dependency. The shift isn't explosive, it doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic event. Instead, it advances through a series of subtle adjustments, new partnerships, revised economic strategies, and concessions that gradually reshape the country's internal structure. To the average citizen, life may appear unchanged at first, but beneath the surface, the balance of power is already tilting in ways that leave little room for recovery. The nation's growing reliance on external financing, especially from China and other geopolitical players, has created a financial landscape that looks stable on paper but fragile in practice. Loans tied to infrastructure and energy projects offer short-term relief and visible progress, but their repayment terms lock Nicaragua into a long-term cycle of obligations that narrow its options. Over time, these conditions shift from financial constraints to political leverage. Decisions about resource allocation, regulatory frameworks, and development priorities increasingly align with the interests of those providing the capital rather than the needs of the local population. At the same time, Nicaragua's internal political environment has become more centralized and less responsive to public pressure. As governments face mounting economic stress, they often turn to tighter control to maintain order, limiting dissent and consolidating authority. This pattern is not unique to Nicaragua. It is a common feature of nations entering the final stages of the financial cycle. Once external obligations grow heavier than domestic legitimacy, governments become defensive rather than adaptive. They suppress criticism to maintain stability, inadvertently accelerating the erosion of institutional trust. Economic stress amplifies these tensions. Inflation may not explode overnight, but it creeps steadily into daily life, altering prices, wages, and purchasing power. Businesses struggle to adapt, especially smaller enterprises that lack the resources to absorb rising costs or fluctuating demand. Foreign influence in critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy sectors adds another layer of dependency that reduces national resilience. In such an environment, even minor disruptions, a change in commodity prices, a diplomatic dispute, or a financial downgrade, can trigger disproportionate consequences. Nicaragua is not yet in full collapse, but the trajectory is clear. The nation is entering the stage where financial pressures begin dictating political decisions, where sovereignty becomes conditional, and where any attempt to reverse course would require more leverage than the country currently possesses. This blend of economic fragility and tightening governance is the hallmark of Stage 6 emerging in slow motion. It is the moment when the margin for error disappears, and the consequences of past decisions begin shaping every direction forward, setting the stage for the deep transformations that define the final phase of the cycle. Across Latin America, the repetition of this financial cycle is not random. It is a structural pattern embedded in the region's economic history, political culture, and geopolitical position. When you analyze each country individually, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Honduras, you see unique contexts, different leaders, and distinct crises. But when you zoom out, the similarities become impossible to ignore. The same vulnerabilities appear again and again. The same dependence on external capital, the same exposure to commodity prices, the same political polarization that prevents long-term planning. These elements converge into a pattern that replicates itself across borders, as though the entire region is operating within the same script. What binds these countries to the same trajectory is the combination of limited diversification and historical constraints. Many Latin American economies depend heavily on exporting raw materials instead of building robust manufacturing or technological sectors. This makes them extremely sensitive to global market fluctuations. When commodity prices rise, money flows in and optimism follows. Governments borrow more, invest more, and expand social programs. But when prices fall, the entire economic structure destabilizes. Debt becomes harder to service, currencies weaken, and political tensions rise. It's a predictable cycle, yet leaders often act as though the downturns are unexpected tragedies rather than mathematical outcomes of structural dependency. International lenders and foreign investors understand this dynamic well. They step in during vulnerable moments, offering capital with terms crafted to protect their interests rather than the borrower's future. These agreements are rarely designed to build long-term resilience. Instead, they create layers of obligations that deepen dependency. Over time, governments lose the flexibility to address internal needs because their policies must align with external expectations. This is how the financial cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Each crisis leads to more borrowing, and each round of borrowing tightens the constraints even further. Political systems across the region amplify the fragility. Changing administrations often reverse previous policies, disrupt continuity, and prioritize short-term gains over structural reforms. In many countries, political competition turns into ideological warfare rather than collaborative governance. Institutions weaken gradually, not through dramatic collapse, but through slow erosion. Trust in leaders declines. Trust in public systems fades. As confidence drops, financial markets react with increased volatility, creating even more instability. The population feels the effects immediately, long before they understand the underlying causes. And as these pressures accumulate, the region moves collectively toward the upper stages of the cycle. What were once isolated national challenges blend into a continental pattern. Economic stress spreads across borders, influencing migration, trade, and diplomatic relationships. Nations begin mirroring one another's crises, not because they cooperate, but because they share the same vulnerabilities shaped by history and reinforced by global financial structures. At this stage, the region no longer deals with individual economic downturns. It confronts a systemic cycle that affects everyone simultaneously, preparing the ground for the final phase, where the consequences of long-term dependency become unavoidable. When a nation finally crosses into the last stage of the financial cycle, the shift feels less like a sudden catastrophe and more like a gradual tightening of pressure that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Institutions that once served as stabilizing forces begin to lose their effectiveness. Governments find themselves reacting to crises rather than shaping policy, and the population senses that the situation is slipping beyond the reach of ordinary solutions. This is the stage where financial dependency becomes structural reality, where foreign influence is no longer subtle, and where every decision is shaped by constraints accumulated over decades. The country is no longer navigating the cycle. It is being carried by it. Currencies weaken under the weight of accumulated debt, making imports more expensive and daily life more difficult. Inflation becomes a constant presence, eroding the value of savings and pushing families into survival mode. Industries that once symbolized national strength struggle to compete, and the promise of economic recovery fades as growth becomes increasingly dependent on external approval rather than internal productivity. At the same time, political systems fracture under pressure. Leaders try to project confidence, but their decisions reveal how little room they have to maneuver. In moments like this, even small shocks, an unexpected downgrade, a diplomatic conflict, a sudden change in global markets, can accelerate the downward spiral. As trust weakens, people begin to withdraw from the system emotionally and economically. Businesses hold back on investment. Young professionals look toward other countries for opportunities. Communities adapt to uncertainty as a normal part of life. This collective shift marks the psychological dimension of the final stage, where the population no longer believes in the promises of stability. And once belief fades, the system loses an essential pillar of resilience. Nations reaching this phase are not doomed by a single event. They are worn down by the cumulative weight of dependency, fragility, and external leverage. What happens next varies from country to country, but the pattern remains recognizable. Some nations undergo deep restructuring, often forced by external institutions. Others experience political transformation, where new leaders rise by promising radical solutions to long-standing problems. And still, others attempt to rebuild by confronting the vulnerabilities that push them into the cycle. Regardless of the path, the transition is always marked by profound change, economic, political, and social. This is the point where history turns, not by choice, but by necessity. If you reach this point with me, it means you understand how these cycles shape nations far beyond headlines or political speeches. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment saying something like, "I'm with you until the end, so I know you followed this journey all the way through." If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue exploring these patterns with us. Your presence here makes this conversation stronger. And if the content connected with you, a simple like helps keep this dialogue alive and growing. There's another video right here that expands on these ideas and pushes the discussion even deeper. Click it and continue with me on the next step of this investigation, where the patterns become even clearer and the implications even more significant.